Welcome back to episode 8 of Sibling Rivalry on my podcast India and the World. At the end of the last episode, we saw the 1965 India-Pakistan war come to a halt on September 23rd thanks to a United Nations mediated ceasefire. The guns fell silent, but there was no decisive outcome. The two armies were locked in a tense standoff. Indian troops held strategic territories inside Pakistani occupied Kashmir, including the Hajipir Pass and also some areas in mainland Pakistan. Pakistani forces held a smaller amount of Indian territory in the Cham sector and in the Rajasthan desert. Today, let's find out what happened when the generals handed over the battle to the statesmen and diplomats. Superpower maneuverings gave birth to a controversial peace treaty which left both sides feeling shortchanged. The repercussions had a long-term impact on the subcontinent. Let's see what happened in the fateful months after the war. Up until now, in every crisis between India and Pakistan, United States and Great Britain had taken the initiative to mediate. But situation in 1965 was different. President Lyndon B. Johnson had his hands full dealing with the Vietnam War. He had no desire to expend diplomatic energy on Kashmir. The British Prime Minister Harold Wilson had been instrumental in mediating during the run of Kutch standoff earlier that year. But at this point, he had lost his political capital with India. When the Indian Army crossed the international border on September 6th and advanced towards Lahore to relieve pressure on Kashmir, Wilson had issued a harsh public statement condemning India's aggression. He also asked India not to use UK supplied weapons in the war. This caused massive outrage in New Delhi. India felt Britain has abandoned neutrality and was taking a blatantly pro-Pakistani stance. The goodwill that it had built up over the years, and especially following its support to India after the 1962 Sino-Indian War, was lost. So while US and UK didn't want to mediate, for the Soviet Union it was a golden opportunity. Moscow wanted to expand its influence in South Asia and stabilize its southern frontier. The Soviets were also wary of China's growing relationship with Pakistan. A peace initiative mediated by them would allow Soviet Union to sideline China and emerge as the ultimate peacemaker in Asia. The US had no problem with this. Dean Rusk, the US Secretary of State, explained the US rationale as follows, I quote, "We encouraged the Russians to go ahead because we felt that we had nothing to lose. If they succeeded in bringing about a detente, then there would be a peace on the subcontinent between India and Pakistan, and we would gain from the fact. If the Russians failed at Tashkent, at least the Russians would have the experience of some of the frustrations that we had faced for 20 years in trying to sort out things between India and Pakistan." Unquote. Accordingly, on 8th December 1965, a simultaneous announcement was made in Moscow, Delhi and Rawalpindi that Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin had invited Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and Pakistani President Field Marshal Ayub Khan to a summit in Tashkent from 4th January 1966, and that both leaders had accepted. Their reasons for accepting were very different though. Both wanted separate outcomes from the negotiations. India wanted to formalize the ceasefire and secure a no-war pact. Pakistan desperately wanted the Soviets to pressure India into making concessions on Kashmir. The summit began on 4th January. The Russian team consisted of Premier Kosygin, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and Defense Minister Marshal Malinovsky. Shastri was accompanied by Foreign Minister Sardar Swaran Singh and Defense Minister Y.B. Chavan. Ayub was accompanied by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the Foreign Minister, Ghulam Farooq, Minister for Commerce, and Khwaja Shahabuddin, Minister for Information. Kosygin met Shastri and Ayub separately the first evening, and both sides explained their opening positions. The Soviets were at this stage simply willing to act as conduits of messages between the two sides. India's position was summarized by Shastri as follows. India wanted a no-war pact with Pakistan. It wanted assurance that Pakistan would not launch another preemptive strike or a Gibraltar-like insurgent operation against India. The only settlement New Delhi would be prepared to consider on Kashmir would be a permanent division of the state along the ceasefire line. This solution had initially been proposed in 1963 by India at the Bhutto Swaran Singh talks. This is borne out by declassified CIA documents. It has reportedly come up several times through back-channel dialogue subsequently. But India's official stance remains that Pakistan occupied Kashmir is very much a part of India, and this stance has hardened of late. At Tashkent, India reiterated that Indian part of Kashmir was not open to discussion. Pakistan's objectives were the opposite. It wanted to reopen the question of Jammu and Kashmir's very accession to India. Pakistan wanted India to vacate all the strategic passes its troops had captured. It was not willing to give any assurance about not using force to change the status of Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan desired the revival of Kashmir as an international issue at the United Nations, which would lead to the implementation of the UN resolutions of 1948. It conveniently ignored the provision in the same resolution that required Pakistan to vacate POK before a plebiscite could be held. Its aim was to achieve politically what it had failed to do militarily. Shastri and Ayub met for the first time on 5th January for substantive talks face to face. There was a detailed discussion about their respective positions on Kashmir, the origin of war, and the possible solutions. The Indians stuck to their position that Kashmir was an integral part of India and not negotiable. This was highlighted by Shastri, who told Ayub bluntly in Urdu, "I am afraid it will displease you to hear this, but we cannot give up Kashmir." By all accounts, it was a polite and courteous discourse, but neither leader conceded an inch diplomatically and no headway was made. Discussions between Sardar Swaran Singh and his counterpart Bhutto were not as polite though. A draft agreement presented by the Indian side provided for the mutual withdrawal of forces, peace on the frontiers, good neighborly relations, the settlement of disputes by peaceful measures, and abjuring the use of force. The Indian draft was rejected in toto by the Pakistani side. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto fiercely argued, demanding that India agree to a mechanism to settle the Kashmir dispute. Swaran Singh flatly refused. After 4 days of back and forth, it was clear that no progress was being made and an atmosphere of hostility prevailed. Pakistani newspaper Karachi Dawn emphasized the prevailing mood with the headline, "Tashkent may break up today." But failure of the talks was something all the parties wanted to avoid. The Soviet Union's political and diplomatic credibility would suffer a setback if that happened. Ayub and Bhutto could not return to Pakistan without showing some results after the hype that had been stirred up by their wildly exaggerated claims of military victory. For Shastri, this was the first major international initiative he had undertaken as Prime Minister, and of course, the most important one. Hence, his prestige also hinged on a successful outcome. The Russians had so far remained discreetly in the background. Now, seeing the negotiations in a deadlock, they began to actively intervene. They had understood that it was impossible to obtain any compromise from Bhutto, who had displayed a markedly hawkish stance throughout. They found his insistence on including the Kashmir issue in any settlement quite irritating. So they decided to try and work on Ayub instead, who appeared more reasonable of the two. Kosygin decided to talk to Ayub and Shastri himself, and he spent hours shuttling between their villas. Ayub knew Pakistan was in a terrible bind. Their military was running out of ammunition and spare parts, and foreign military supply had been cut off. The United States was clearly backing the Russian peace initiative, and Pakistan was under a lot of pressure from all the Western powers to come to a settlement with India. Ayub had visited Washington the previous December, immediately after ceasefire. Lyndon Johnson had bluntly told him that United States could not influence India on Kashmir and advised him to get it out of your system. Kosygin now talked to Ayub about the soundness of India's proposed step-by-step approach and convinced him to accept a simple ceasefire without a Kashmir mechanism. At the same time, Kosygin worked on Shastri agreeing to withdrawal of Indian troops from Hajipir and other strategic territories captured during the war. Immediately after its capture, Shastri had declared that India would never vacate Hajipir Pass. At one stage, he even proclaimed that if Hajipir had to be returned to Pakistan, some other Prime Minister would do it. Kosygin ultimately convinced Shastri on the basis of two arguments. First, that the UN resolution of August and September 1965 had clearly recommended the withdrawal of forces by both sides to positions which they had occupied before 5th August 1965. He argued that positions won by India during the war were fruits of aggression and therefore had to be returned. The second argument was that India vacating these posts would serve the larger interests of stability in Indo-Pakistani relations. Shastri reluctantly agreed. Journalist Kuldeep Nayyar, who was part of Shastri's entourage, claimed Soviet pressure and threats to withdraw UN veto support on Kashmir influenced the decision of the Prime Minister. As per a declassified CIA document, I quote, "The Indian concession on this point, which may come under heavy fire from hardliners in New Delhi, is probably the result of persistent Soviet encouragement," unquote. This says more between the lines than it does within them. The moment Ayub and Shastri indicated their agreement, a draft was quickly prepared and presented to both for acceptance. But Bhutto stepped in and insisted on changes to the draft, the most important being to strike out a specific no war clause. Neither the Soviet Union nor India wanted to rock the boat by haggling too much and were happy enough to reconstitute the draft. On 10th January 1966, Shastri and Ayub signed the Tashkent Declaration. Bhutto had refused to allow it to be called an agreement. It declared the firm resolve to restore normal and peaceful relations between their countries and to promote understanding and friendly relations between their peoples. By the end of February, all troops were to be withdrawn by both countries to positions they had held prior to 5th August 1965, and both sides agreed to observe ceasefire terms on the ceasefire line. On Kashmir, the very reason the war was fought, the declaration offered Pakistan absolutely nothing. It contained a single vague sentence. I quote, "It was against this background that Jammu and Kashmir was discussed and each of the sides set forth its respective position," end quote. There was no mechanism for a plebiscite, no promise of arbitration. It was hardly a diplomatic victory for either side, yet perhaps it accurately reflected the battlefield outcome of a stalemate. But before the curtains went down, the story of Tashkent was about to take a sudden shocking turn. That night, there was a banquet to celebrate the Declaration, and after attending it, Prime Minister Shastri retired to his dacha at about 10 o'clock. He was to stop in Kabul next day on his way back home to Delhi. Ayub had invited him to stop in Rawalpindi as well, for those two leaders had come to respect one another after a week of interactions. Shortly after 1 am, Shastri woke up with a sharp pain in his chest. His physician, R.N. Chugh, was accompanying him and he was summoned immediately. But it was too late. Death occurred at 2 am on 11th January 1966. News of Shastri's death was flashed around the world. All the three national flags on the route from city of Tashkent to the airport were flying at past next morning as the procession carrying his body passed. At the airport, after a gentle prod from Kosygin, Ayub assisted him in lifting Shastri's coffin onto the airplane. In his tribute, Ayub called Shastri a man of peace who gave his life for amity between India and Pakistan. Many in India still believe that there was a conspiracy behind Shastri's death, that he had been poisoned and silenced. But no historical evidence or medical reports to back any foul play were found. So by all accounts, he succumbed to his third heart attack brought on by the immense stress of the war and the grueling negotiations. The conspiracy remains in the realms of speculation. There was a smooth and democratic transition in India's leadership, with Mrs. Indira Gandhi being sworn in as the Prime Minister immediately. Shastri's tragic death completely changed the domestic reaction to the outcome of Tashkent in India. The anger over the return of the Haji Pir Pass was drowned out by a massive wave of public sorrow and sympathy for a leader who was seen as having given his life for peace. The Indian public accepted the Tashkent Declaration as his final legacy. But there was no such relief for Ayub. For weeks, the state-controlled Pakistani media had fed the public a diet of absolute fantasy. They had been led to believe that the Pakistani army had dealt a crushing blow to the Indians. Ministry of Information campaign in Pakistan had convinced the population that the military war was won, and now they merely had to seal the diplomatic win. The logical outcome of the glorious victory should therefore have been the liberation of Kashmir. Massive appropriations of the nation's wealth to the war chest had been justified on these grounds. After all this, far from liberation, the declaration barely mentioned Kashmir. It was a stinging diplomatic defeat for Pakistan. Realization that the war may have been in vain was dawning on the Pakistani people. The photograph of Ayub, looking sombre and moved, acting as a pallbearer for Shastri, added to the sense of shock and outrage in Pakistan. This impression was further strengthened when Ayub made no speech or public declaration about Tashkent on return to Pakistan. Rampaging mobs ran amok cursing Ayub Khan and his government, and on 13th January, 2 students were killed in large and angry demonstrations in Lahore. The chant "Hame khoon ka jawab do" rang through the streets of Pakistan. War widows marched down the roads screaming that their husbands had died in vain. On 14 January, the Ayub government was desperate enough to order the closure of all educational institutions. Bhutto, being a smart politician, distanced himself from the decisions taken at Tashkent. He kept up a half-hearted public defense of the Tashkent Declaration while claiming at the same time that he had not participated in the direct talks between Ayub and Shastri. At public rallies, he began hinting darkly that there was a secret clause in the Tashkent Declaration where Ayub had sold out Pakistan. The public was convinced that Ayub had succumbed to international pressure and had surrendered on the negotiating table the hard-fought victories of the battlefield. Bhutto leveraged the groundswell of public criticism to question the motivation and performance of Ayub. He was forced out of the Ayub's cabinet in mid-1966. He went on to found the Pakistan People's Party in 1967, riding a wave of anti-Tashkent anger. Vowing Islam as its faith, democracy as its politics, and socialism as its economy, the PPP promised all power to the people and adopted the populist slogan, "Food, clothing and housing is everyone's demand." While Ayub retained the support of some senior politicians and governors, his aura of efficiency and decisiveness vanished. His command and authority over the officers of the armed forces had also diminished because of the failure of the military effort. More ominously, the army was getting politicized and split among various factions. Exhausted, politically crippled, and suffering from failing health, Ayub Khan was eventually forced to resign in March 1969, handing power to General Yahya Khan. The 1965 war and Tashkent Declaration had thus directly or indirectly resulted in massive political changes in the subcontinent. Vital lessons were also learnt by both sides. India learned that it could hold the line in Kashmir but would always face international pressure. Pakistan learned a much harsher lesson. The West would not fight its battles, and military adventurism without economic power leads to disaster. We stop the narrative here for today. In our next episode, we will take the story forward to a political deadlock in Pakistan that would tear that nation apart and give birth to Bangladesh. Thank you for listening. Please do join us for the next episode and do consider subscribing to the podcast. Please do share the link with friends who may be interested. See you next time.